About the Port Authority's finances after commissioners voted last Friday to raise tolls on downstate bridges and tunnels. Governors Cuomo and Christie called for a full-scale audit in exchange for their support of these increases. But critics say that the Port Authority's money troubles will continue as long as it continues to be responsible for the redevelopment of Ground Zero. My next guest questions whether taxpayers should be on the hook for this new construction. Here to explain more is Empire Center Senior Fellow E.J. McMahon. You know him, of course. E.J., it's good to see you.
Good to see you.
This is a pretty interesting suggestion, particularly coming so close to the 10th anniversary. Could you just walk us through the financial part of it, if you would?
Well, there's the toll increase, which everybody has heard about, is in the long term getting to a pretty high level because if tolls, peak hour tolls on the Port Authority's crossings had kept pace with inflation over the last 30 years, we'd now be hitting $5. Instead, it's going to $9.50 on its way to over $12. And the governors talk about audits. This might remind you about the MTA, in fact, some of this.
It's eerily...
There's a mystery. What's going on here?
Eerily similar,
but
actually.
This is a mystery, yeah. It's a mystery playing out in slow motion in plain sight, because what happened is, and there's an irony also, almost exactly 10 years ago, there was another 10-year anniversary that we just passed, and that anniversary is the anniversary of the afternoon, a sun-baked afternoon in late July 2001. When Governor George Pataki and his counterpart at the time in New Jersey, Governor DeFrancisco, stood on the plaza of the then World Trade Center and, in effect, handed over the keys to Silverstein,
Larry Silverstein,
the developer, right, and said, realizing a long-term priority, one of Governor Pataki's real triumphs. In fact, if the Pataki administration had ended that afternoon, it would have been one of his biggest legacies. Because from the moment he took office, he said we should be why is the Port Authority in the real estate business?
Right.
It should be
why
focused
is any
on
authority really? The
right.
MTA certainly the same. I mean, over the years, critics have said the MTA owns real estate, should not be in the real estate business. The MTA runs transit. The Port Authority similarly.
The MTA inherited a good deal of its real estate from the suburban railroads it took over. The Port Authority got in the real estate business due to classic public authority empire building.
Right.
The confluence of Austin Tobin, the director of the Port Authority then, and Nelson Rockefeller's Freudian slip, boundless ambitions in every direction to build the original World Trade Center. The Port Authority was the vehicle for the building of the World Trade Center.
Yeah, and just to remind people, we have talked about this whole shadow government thing. I mean, the reason why authorities exist, sometimes good, sometimes bad, is to circumvent this whole bond limit and be able basically to blow the limits on borrowing.
So the original World Trade Center, a fabulously ambitious project involving the two tallest buildings in the world at the time, or at least momentarily, was a huge white elephant for most of its existence, finally had filled up and begun making money in a real sense in the late 1990s. Governor Pataki had taken office saying, let's sell the towers and the hotel nearby and the retail, let's privatize all of it so the Port Authority can focus on its core mission, which is transportation and infrastructure.
Okay, so if that had all gone according to plan, minus the terrible attacks and the tragedy, etc., do you believe the Port Authority would be solvent today?
Yes.
You do?
I mean, it is still solvent, but the sense is, would they be seeking the toll hike they're now seeking? Would they have so little capital available, which they do at the moment, for actual transportation infrastructure? No. I mean, again, a lot of things would be different if it were not for the attacks, obviously.
Sure.
But the rebuilding of so-called Ground Zero has been this albatross for the Port Authority. By default, and through some political decisions made in the immediate wake of the attacks, it became the Port Authority's project all over again.
We should also remind people the Port Authority is like its own entity. It's like the Vatican. It has its own army, practically, doesn't it?
It does. It has its own police force, which has grown for security reasons since 9/11. It is a bi-state authority. It has been viewed as this enormous honeypot for decades because the Port Authority was seen as this bottomless pit. And most public authorities, the shortcoming of all public authorities is they lack direct accountability to the public. The strength is supposed to be they can operate in a business-like manner and do things that normal agencies can't do as effectively. That's the argument. The downside always has been is they're less accountable. Well, the Port Authority is even less accountable than that because the Port Authority is the creature of not one but two states.
Right. That's how you get to two governors saying, well, I didn't know. Did you know? I didn't know. Wait a minute. What happened here? Right. When you come to the toll increase. But you're suggesting We've already, I mean, to a certain degree, taxpayers are already on the hook. I mean, the redevelopment is going on. You're saying sell what has already been constructed?
Start thinking about, this is nothing that can be done easily, because
Obviously
keep in mind that what's going on at the World Trade Center site now is political in origin. There's no economic sense to what's going on. This is being done because after 9/11, it was the spirit of the community and the nation and our leaders was, we've got to rebuild and show this, we're not going to be kept down. Okay. But the fact of the matter is, it's not actually economic. The building, the tower, is going to actually cost more to build than the Port Authority itself will say that it's worth. Okay? I mean, that's because of the nature of the site. So what we're suggesting, Nicole Gelinas, my colleague at the Manhattan Institute, and I, in this piece we wrote on this for the New York Post, is that we should be already thinking ahead to the time when we can cut our losses. Don't stay neck deep in this project for another generation. Don't wait and hope through the next 20 to 30 years that this whole site will become economically, that will begin paying for itself and you can somehow extricate yourself.
Right.
It's time to think about cutting your losses.
You also note that there are actually tenants.
Yes.
The problem is that when those leases, for example, one of them is a media tenant.
Right.
And you just don't know where the world of media, which has been changing so rapidly. I mean, 10 years ago, who knew that we would be looking at blogs and tweets and podcasts and whatever all else, iPads. So you just don't know where people are going to want to be at that point.
Condé Nast, which is a fabulously successful, highly regarded media and publishing organization, which has a below-market rate deal at a very successful redevelopment project. Times Square in Midtown Manhattan has been there about 20 years. Well, their landlord, Durst, has now been brought in to lease out the tower. He's gotten them to move down to the World Trade Center site. But the fact of the matter is, there's going to be a long slog involved in leasing out all that office space down there. Ironically, Larry Silverstein has leased out most of his building that he's finished. The one finished building down there is, I think, 7 World Trade Centers, the tower that Silverstein built. But I'm not suggesting simplistically, privatize, the private sector can do it better. This is not economical. I mean, like, this requires recognizing you've got sunk costs in here you're not going to escape from. You just need to sort of cut your losses and start thinking about getting out of it, which will ultimately involve paying somebody to take some of it off your hands.
Well, which is a problem for the state, of course. So, okay, look, we're going to be talking a lot about 9/11, particularly going forward into the next week and a half, because of the anniversary. That's part of the reason why I brought you in, to sort of get that ball rolling. But I also want to ask you before I let you go, is George Pataki, who you mentioned at sort of the top of this interview, is now being talked about again in a national stage. He's talked about as a moderate. Right. Do you believe, actually, from a financial standpoint, from a fiscal standpoint, that is a fair way to describe him? Apt, I should say, not fair. An apt way to describe him.
Well, it depends, and moderate means different things in the state of New York than it does nationally.
Right.
There's also a couple of different George Patakis you could talk about.
Early Pataki,
there's early, mid, and late.
Right.
The Governor Pataki's first term was, and I would say arguably just about the first half of his tenure, was highly successful by many measures, including the standards he had set for himself. I mentioned the privatization of World Trade Center. In terms of the state budget, state spending, he actually did 2 things that people said couldn't be done. He significantly cut taxes and reduced spending at the same time. The second half of his tenure became progressively less successful. There was a significant spending blowout his last 5 years in office. Now, he vetoed billions of dollars in legislative spending on the one hand. On the other hand, as a political matter, he was in a position at that point to be rolled, and people might say that's a judgment on him politically. Even with that, he did leave a surplus of about $3 billion, depending on how you count it, for Eliot Spitzer, which is now more than half gone.
Right. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but we are going to be talking a little bit more about the governor, I believe, the former governor, because we're expecting a decision from him within next week and a half, 2 weeks, you don't know. But in the meantime, I want to thank you very much, EJ, for coming in, because it's always great to talk to you.